Hi there, welcome back to 19th Century Art. In this lecture, we're going to look at realism as it begins in France with the artists of Millet and Courbet. We have to start to take a serious look at the sorry state of the Academy in France. Its authority over the production of fine art had been fading. Many artists were turned off by its insular and heavily politicized decisions. Here, Thomas Couture pictures the Roman decadence of the high empire of the classical past, ironically pointing out this is the society that we hold as our highest ideal. In reality, Couture had felt deeply burned. He had tried 6 times to win the Prix de Rome, so he could go to Rome and learn from the classics and become an established artist. Instead, he developed his own studio practice and had students whom he actively discouraged from trying to join the art academy. Realism was born out of this frustration and disenchantment with the classical past. But it was also born from new kinds of ideas that were coming into the world. First was the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which pointed out the unfair oppression of the working classes. Now, it's one thing to say the people have been deeply concerned about the oppression of the working classes since before the French Revolution and the Luddites. But what's interesting about the Communist Manifesto is it looks at the system of society, and it points a finger not to the machines of the oppression, the new technology, but larger structural inequalities in this whole social system. And this is a really interesting idea because it abstracts the structure of the society out from this role of tradition and the way things have always been done, and says this system itself needs to be changed. The other important book that arrives after this was Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, which was published in 1859. Charles Darwin was notoriously slow at publishing this book. He had pretty much his whole theory worked out by 1847, but then spent a great deal of time laboring over these excruciating details. Many people who have written his biography have pointed out that he was terrified of religious persecution because he knew that this was going to just absolutely shake the foundations of people's religious faiths, because he was displacing human beings as a unique creature, a creation of God above the natural world, and instead pointing out how we are merely an animal among other animals. Both of these are very startling and disturbing ideas about the structure of society and our place within the world. And these are the kinds of questions that the realists were trying to get at. Now remember, we were looking at landscape. In our first section, the Barbizon School was in France, a place where a number of artists escaped from Paris to go out to the countryside and draw from nature. Jean-Francois Millet was one of these artists, but instead of going there to enjoy the beautiful scenery and paint the cows and the greenery, he focused on the people, their lives, their hardships, their labor, and he really was fascinated by their resiliency and their toughness and their grace. And you see that in this beautiful lithograph, The Sower from 1851, where he shows the man in the act of sowing the seeds and this powerful gesture as he's striding through the fields, his hand sweeping back, scattering the seeds, and the landscape rises up to his chest. It's this way in which we see him at one with the land. And quite fascinating how the scattering seeds are reflected in the birds flying in the sky, as if as soon as they hit the ground, the birds are descending to eat them up. It's a way in which we see almost the futility of this determination. Millet was fascinated by this culture, and he wanted to bring the life of ordinary people to the salon, but he knew that the salon would reject an overt and direct view of the poverty outside Paris. And so he couches his painting in a biblical parable. Here he conceives this painting as a depiction of Ruth, a poor widow who supported herself by gathering grain left behind by the harvesters. This was a tradition that was still practiced in France at this time, and they were known as the gleaners. When the artist exhibited this work in the Salon of 1853, however, he changed the title to underscore its contemporary significance. Millet has painted the peasants of his own time, and the setting is the fertile plain of Chailly, the breadbasket for much of France. In the 1850s, rural France was increasingly owned by absentee landlords more interested in their personal gain than the welfare of the people who worked their fields. The gleaner's meager bundle you see in the blue is contrasted poignantly with the stacks of grain behind her. In 1857, Millet removes all pretense of the biblical story and directly allows us to see the gleaners at work, bent double over, picking up the seeds one by one from the ground, their hands roughened and coarsened by this backbreaking labor. In 1857, he submitted the painting, The Gleaners, to the Salon to an unenthusiastic, even hostile public. Perhaps one of Millet's most famous paintings is the Angelus, which is the name of a prayer that peasants will say at sunset as they are going about their field. You see them, they've stopped their labors, they put down their work tools, laid down their gathering baskets, and they've said a prayer. You see far in the distance a church bell, which we can imagine is tolling at this time. The painting has an intimacy and a power that's really quite beautiful. It has the way in which Millet brings the landscape up to their chests, so we see them in their environment, in their world. In this intimate way, it creates this very powerful and poignant sense of faith that these people had in their life and in their way of being. And yet, for some, there was something darker, something more disturbing about this painting that lay behind it. And it was the painter 70 years later, Salvador Dali. He comes and he sees this painting and he's so inspired by it. I know, it's such an odd painting for Salvador Dali to find himself so transfixed by. And he insists there is something darker to this picture. And so he asks the Louvre to undertake an X-ray of the painting. And sure enough, they find where the potato baskets now sit. There was, in an earlier inception of this painting, a small box that looks like a coffin. These two peasants are not saying their typical prayer on a typical day. Instead, they are saying goodbye to their child. Here, to finish the story, is Salvador Dali's interpretation of Millet's Angelus. Gustave Courbet was the archetypal bohemian artist who had an incredible and daring way of going about art that was hugely transformative and influential. He too, like Millet, wanted to celebrate the people and the work that gets so often overlooked. And so in 1849, he begins this painting looking at the stonebreakers, the people who have the meager existence of working by the side of the road, breaking stone, laying flagstones. And we see them with their backs turned to us. We can't read their expressions. We don't know who they are. They are this faceless entity that serves us, that builds the roads we drive on. And yet there they are in their ragged clothes, barely able to sustain themselves in this one little cook pot there in the corner. You can see how this is the orbit of their existence. It's a masterful painting, full of vivid, extraordinary detail, and rich with the sense of this is really happening here in the world. And it's a huge painting, okay? It's 5 feet tall and 7 feet, more than 7 feet long. And so it occupies a space that would normally be going to a history painting, but by its design, it feels like a genre painting. A genre painting trying to be a history painting, but it's not giving us a history. It's telling us this is happening here and now. Of course, this was, again, critically put down by many people who felt that this was an inappropriate subject for the noble subject of a history painting. Gustave Courbet went home to his town in Ornans and there was visiting for his family gathering for the burial of his great uncle. And he took this up as the subject of this absolutely stunning painting. Here it is, even larger, 10 feet tall, 21.5 feet long, and he's painted the people of his village going about this funeral. And we see all the people who are in attendance, and it's like these portraits. And instead of using professional models to hold the pose, and he really got the actual people to come in and he would paint them. And so this is like an incredible realism. We're seeing real people going about their lives, their faith, and right there in the very front, this ditch, which is the grave, is like right there for us. We almost could peek over and look inside. It's this incredible picture that really presents life as it is lived. Now, Courbet is giving us a scene that is complicating our idea of what is worthy of commemoration. This is so far from the coronation of Napoleon and the great and grand narratives of other history paintings. But why isn't the death of his great uncle, a man like any other man, worthy of our contemplation? Perhaps one of my favorite paintings by Courbet is this extremely peculiar painting with the ungainly title, The Artist's Studio, a real allegory of a 7-year phase in my artistic and moral life. Now that title seems like the kind of title you would find in a history painting. It's an allegory. It's, metaphorical for the way things actually happen. And yet when we look at it, it looks very realistic. I mean, there's people are painted are very ordinary. It's not like the allegory of the birth of Venus. It's not an allegory that brings up any kind of idea of a narrative that makes any sense. It's hard to say what we're really even looking at. We see the artist dead center. He's painting a landscape, and beside him, looking on, is what appears to be his nude model, who is nowhere in the picture. And then there's this young boy right there with a dog rolling around on the ground. Who are these people? Why are they there? The model's mother? Is that the woman in the shawl on the right? Who are these people reading newspapers, hangers on? What is going on in this picture? And then there's this vast space all above and around it. It's an interior space, but it's cavernous. And what is he trying to communicate? What is he trying to tell us about these artistic inner life of this artist? And it's funny because it's not just an allegory. It's a real allegory. It's a paradox because there's no such thing as a real allegory. Allegories aren't real. They're symbolic representations of reality. So he's again created something which is this enigma. Can we ever know anything that's really going on in the artist's head? Can we ever understand what the painting was meant to mean to the artist who made it? And so this is a beautiful painting which sums up the complexity of artistic creation without really giving us any answers. Now, Courbet did not have much success at the Salon. As you can imagine, his work was just confrontational, bizarre, confusing, too realistic. And instead, he found a way to go to the beach in the summer and hobnob with the rich and famous on vacation, and there ingratiate himself and try and find patrons and people willing to purchase his work firsthand. And this is how he began to move outside the ordinary circles of your typical artist. He was no doubtedly, in this painting you can see the beach at Trouville, enormously talented. So he would set up his easel on the beach, and walkers by would go, "Oh, how lovely. Can you paint one of me too?" And so this is the way in which he began to sort of advertise outside the official channels of Paris society. And it's in this way he came upon one of his most famous commissions, which later be known as the Origin of the World. The painting is, of course, of a woman's midsection with a very decided view of her crotch. It was commissioned by the Ottoman diplomat Halil Sarif Pasha and painted in the summer of 1866. I'm showing you the best digital image I could find on the internet. It is really hard to find a clear close-up of this picture. I guess it's being censored because it's pornography. Or is it fine art? It's made by a famous artist. Anyways, this is what I have to show you. This is how you can see it if you ever happen to be in the Guillemets at Paris. What I found interesting was during COVID, the people of the internet began to create reconstructions of their favorite paintings that they could no longer see in person. And one clever person put together the origin of the world, here made from fruits and vegetables found in their kitchen. Now, remember in our previous section, we talked about Daumier and this shocking picture of the murdered family who had been destroyed by Napoleon III's soldiers who charged in and murdered everyone as they suspected they had set a trap for them in the streets. And this is part of an ongoing problem for the military in Paris. Paris was an ancient medieval city with tight, narrow streets and roads, and it was a very difficult city to govern for that reason. It was very easily for the military to get ambushed in these tight, narrow chasms that were built up over time. And so the government put to this man, George Eugene Haussmann, commonly known as Baron Haussmann, and they set him to design a new Paris, to rework the city, and to create a new kind of environment that would allow for the city to function as a modern city, and to get rid of a lot of these lingering neighborhoods of radical leftists. So during the Second Empire, from 1852 to 1870, there was a massive reconstruction of Paris, tearing down whole neighborhoods and plowing these long, straight avenues through wide swathes of the city, allowing for wide troop movements through the city and creating a unified and clearly codified system of building and planning. This was continued in the Third Republic from 1870 to 1940, but at a much slower pace. So the Paris of today is really dependent on this new design. And if you've ever been to Paris, you've seen these long vistas, these building after building with identical heights and windows and rooftops. Everything has been planned out by Baron von Haussmann, and this is how it has to be. Now, the destruction of all these neighborhoods and the creation of this monolithic idea of Paris was all happening against the wishes of the radical left, who were protesting and fighting for their own existence in the city. And so there is a revolution. The whole context for this is far too complicated for me to get into now. But the Paris Commune rises to power with the power vacuum in Paris from 1870, and they realize this is this chance to hold off and even reverse many of the things that have been done to them by this regime. And so this is where they started pulling up the barricades and defending themselves against the return of the military. The Commune was eventually suppressed by the National French Army during the Bloody Week, beginning on the 21st of May, 1871. It is believed that somewhere between 7,000 communards, perhaps as many as 20,000 communards, were killed or executed. This is really the destruction of the political left in Paris, and it would take almost a whole century before the political left regained its footing. During this revolution, this powerful image of the Napoleonic Empire, the Vendôme column, celebrating the many victories of Napoleon based on this neoclassical ideal of the Trajan's column, was toppled, and much of the blame of it went to Gustave Courbet, who had written at the beginning of the revolution in 1870 that this is a monument devoid of all artistic value, tending to perpetuate by its expression the ideas of war and conquest of the past imperial dynasty, which are reproved by a Republican nation sentiment. Citizen Courbet expresses the wish that the National Defense Government will authorize him to disassemble this column. And it was toppled. It's not clear whether Courbet had anything to do with it, but because he had said this in print and may very well have planted this idea in the revolutionary government, he's the one who primarily gets the blame. With the surrender of Paris in 1871, Courbet was given a 6-month prison sentence and a fine, but the Republic was not finished with him as a scapegoat. In 1873, it was proposed to re-erect the column. Bronze panels of the column had survived at a cost at 323,000 francs, which Courbet himself would have to pay off in 10,000 francs a year installments. Instead, he escapes to Switzerland, and there he dies. This is perhaps his last painting, unfinished, the panoramic view of the Alps, and we can see this extraordinary painter and his attempts to eke out an existence on his great artistic skills. I highly recommend, if you're ever in the city of Cleveland, to go and see this amazing painting. Even in its unfinished state, it has a majesty and a power and an intimacy, a view of the ordinary people's lives of Switzerland.